They blocked my water while I was gone for 2 weeks, and by the time I came back, my pasture was already starting to die, and that fence they built wasn't just sitting there. It was standing right on top of a legal water right that had kept my ranch alive for 30 years. I'm Caleb Mercer, and I own a working cattle ranch out in Red Hollow County. Nothing fancy, just land, livestock, and a ditch that runs like a vein through the south side of my property. Or at least it used to before Brighton Vale Estates decided my water was theirs to reroute. I remember pulling back onto the ranch that afternoon, dust still on my boots from the road, expecting the usual sound of water moving through the channel, that low steady rush you don't even notice until it's gone. But instead there was silence, and a new cedar fence stretched clean and perfect like it had always belonged there. At first I just stood there looking at it, thinking maybe I was seeing it wrong. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn after the auction, because nobody builds a 6-foot privacy wall across an irrigation easement without saying a word, not unless they think the law doesn't reach that far out into the dirt. There was a paper zip tied to my fence post, flapping in the wind like it meant something official, something final. It said something about drainage compliance and structural redirection, all clean corporate language that doesn't mean anything when your cattle are standing in dry grass waiting for water that isn't coming. The thing is, that ditch wasn't just water to me. It was history. It was every dry summer we survived, every calf that made it through August heat, because that channel had been running since long before Brighton Vale even showed up on a map. I walked the fence line slow, hands on my hips, and I remember laughing once, just once, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd it almost had to be a mistake, like maybe some subcontractor got overzealous and would fix it tomorrow. But by the second pass, I wasn't laughing anymore. I was just counting, measuring, noticing how intentional it all was, how they didn't just block the water, they built around it like they were erasing it on purpose. When I got back to the house, I pulled the deed file, the old binder I keep for moments like this, and there it was in black and white, a recorded easement, county filed, stamped, signed, 30 years of uninterrupted water rights, not a suggestion, not a courtesy, a legal obligation. And that's when the tone of everything changed for me, because this stopped being about a fence and started being about somebody making a very expensive assumption that nobody out here reads their own history anymore. Brighton Vale Estates. That was the subdivision, cookie-cutter houses, artificial lawns, a clubhouse with a fountain that ran 24/7 like water was something you could pretend never runs out, and right next to it my pasture was cracking open like dry clay. My herd already shifting uneasy near the empty troughs. I stood there for a while just watching them, and I'll be honest, there's a specific kind of anger that doesn't come out loud. It just gets quiet and organized, like your brain stops reacting and starts planning instead. I called my attorney first, a woman named Marlene Tate. Been handling land disputes in this county longer than most of those developers have had a license, and I didn't even have to explain much. I just said they blocked the ditch, and she went silent for a second like she was trying not to swear before she said, "They what?" That was the first crack in their world, because within hours she had an emergency injunction drafted, easement obstruction, destruction of recorded water access, and she filed it before sunset, which meant legally they had already crossed a line they couldn't walk back over without a judge noticing. Then I called the county water board and the agricultural office and a ranching rights attorney out of the next county who owed me a favor from a drought case years back. And suddenly what Brighton Vale thought was a neat construction adjustment turned into a paper trail that started moving faster than their concrete had set. The next morning I got the call from their lawyer, smooth voice, too calm, like he'd practiced it in a mirror, saying this was just a misunderstanding, a temporary drainage adjustment for safety compliance. And I remember leaning against my kitchen counter listening to him try to reframe my water rights like they were a landscaping inconvenience. I told him something simple. I said, "There's no misunderstanding. You buried a legal easement under your fence." And then I opened my folder, read him 30 years of flow records, and told him he could explain it to the county judge because I was done talking. He didn't like that. I could hear the shift in his tone, that little tightening when lawyers realize the other side isn't confused or emotional, they're just prepared. By midday, I had drone footage from a neighbor who owed me a favor, showing the dry channel on my side, and, just beyond the fence line, the subdivision's fountain still running like nothing had happened, and that image did more damage than anything I could have said in court. Then came the developer himself, Evan Kessler, young guy, expensive boots that hadn't seen mud in their life, standing at my gate like he was doing me a favor by showing up in person, smiling like this was a negotiation instead of a mistake. He looked around my land, at the cattle, at the dry ditch, and said, "We can make this right. Caleb, we'll cut you a check for the inconvenience." I remember actually laughing this time, because inconvenience is when your fence falls over in a storm. Inconvenience is not when you cut off water to 200 head of cattle in the middle of summer. I told him, "You didn't inconvenience me, you cut off a lifeline." And for a second his smile flickered. Just barely, like he wasn't used to the idea that money wasn't the final language here. He tried again, said something about counterclaims, construction delays, legal interference, all the usual pressure points. But I could already see where this was going because by then Marlene had already looped in the county, and the story had already started moving outside of his control. And that's when I started to realize this wasn't just a land dispute anymore. It was about whether a piece of paper recorded 30 years ago still meant something when somebody decided it didn't fit their blueprint, and Brighton Vale had just picked the wrong ranch to test that on. By the end of that first day, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was building, not with dirt or fences, but with documents, evidence, timelines, water logs. Everything lined up like a wall they were going to have to climb in front of a judge, and I could already feel the pressure shifting, like the ground under their perfect little subdivision wasn't as stable as they thought. And that's where things started to get interesting, because when people like Evan realize they can't buy their way out, they usually try something else, and I was about to find out exactly what that was. But that's when Marlene called me back and said the judge had agreed to hear the emergency injunction first thing in the morning, and that's where everything really began to tilt. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was worried, but because once a case like this starts moving, you feel it in your gut like a storm that already made landfall somewhere upstream, and you're just waiting for the water to reach you. By sunrise, Marlene was already at the courthouse filing room, and I was standing in my kitchen going through printouts again like they might change overnight. Easement records, survey maps, old water flow logs from drought years when that ditch was the only reason my south pasture didn't turn into dust. Outside, the herd was restless, pacing near the empty troughs, and I remember thinking how quickly something essential becomes invisible until it disappears, like people only notice water when it stops moving. At 9:14 a.m., the emergency injunction hearing started, and I didn't even go inside at first. I stayed in the truck outside the courthouse listening to Marlene on speaker, her voice calm in that way only lawyers get when they know the law is already leaning one direction. Brighton Vale's attorney showed up polished, confident, talking about temporary infrastructure adjustments and development safety protocols, like he was describing a parking lot, not a water source that had been legally protected longer than some of his clients had been alive. Marlene didn't raise her voice once. She just laid it out clean. Easement recorded, county filed, uninterrupted use for 30 years, documented agricultural dependency, and then she dropped the drone footage in. The pasture cracking under heat while the subdivision fountain ran nonstop, like a joke nobody was supposed to notice. There was a pause in the room after that, the kind of silence you only hear when people realize the facts aren't on their side anymore. The judge didn't even hesitate. He granted the temporary injunction by mid-morning, ordered immediate review of the obstruction, and required access restoration pending full hearing. Legally speaking, that should have been the end of it, but in real life it was just the moment everything started to unravel for them. Because by noon, the story wasn't staying inside a courtroom anymore. It was leaking out in the worst possible way for Brighton Vale. First through a local reporter who had covered drought cases before, then through a county clerk who recognized the easement address, then through social media where someone posted the drone clips side by side with the subdivision fountain and added one sentence. "This is happening in the same county." That was all it took. I was back at the ranch when Evan showed up again, this time not smiling, standing by my gate with his phone in his hand like it had been ringing nonstop, which I later found out it had. He didn't even bother with small talk this time, just said, "You went to the media?" I told him I didn't have to, because when something like this is real, it doesn't need help spreading. He looked past me toward the ditch, or what used to be the ditch, and for the first time I saw something different in him. Not arrogance, not confidence, just the realization that a problem can't be negotiated if it's already public. "We're trying to fix this," he said, but it didn't sound like a plan anymore. It sounded like damage control. I leaned on the fence and said, You don't fix water by calling it drainage. And that was when his jaw tightened, like he finally understood this wasn't going to be a quiet settlement. By that evening, his buyers started calling him. I heard that through Marlene first, then confirmed it when a neighbor of mine who works real estate texted me saying contracts were stalling, buyers pulling out, lenders asking questions about pending litigation tied to water rights. Because nobody wants to sign for a house when the ranch next door might own the system that keeps it livable. That's when the pressure shifted fully onto him. Not legally yet, but financially. And that's usually when people like Evan stop arguing and start offering money again. The next day, he came back with a different tone. No gate this time. Just parked halfway down the access road like he didn't want to be seen. And Marlene was with me when he made the offer. He said they'd remove the fence, restore the ditch, cover damages, even compensate for livestock loss. And he said it fast, like if he slowed down the numbers might sound smaller. Marlene didn't even look at me. She just waited, because she already knew my answer. I told him no. That was the first time he looked genuinely confused, like rejection wasn't part of the script he'd been working from. I told him this wasn't about undoing a mistake anymore. It was about how you fix something that was never supposed to be touched in the first place. Then I laid it out, calm, almost like I was reading it off a ledger. Restore flow through a properly engineered underground system, recorded easement stronger than the original, triple allocation based on historical use, and a settlement that accounted for 2 full years of projected agricultural loss, not estimates, documented averages. Marlene slid the draft across the hood of my truck like it was just another day in court, and Evan stared at it like it was written in another language. He tried to push back, said something about precedent, about cost, about setting expectations for future developments. But I could see he wasn't talking to me anymore. He was talking to the wall that just appeared in front of his entire project. By the time he left, the silence felt heavier than the argument, because now it wasn't just a dispute, it was a structure collapsing slowly, one legal document at a time. That night, I stood by the dry ditch again, and I swear you can hear absence differently when you've known something for 30 years. It's not just empty. It feels wrong, like the land is waiting for something that used to belong to it. And somewhere beyond the fence line, Brighton Vale's lights were still on, houses still selling, fountains still running, but the gap between those two worlds was starting to close, not with anger anymore, but with consequences. And what happened next, I didn't see coming as fast as it came, because the county water board decided to open a full review, and that changed the tone of everything overnight. But that's where things really escalated, and Evan finally realized this wasn't a negotiation he could walk away from. By the time the county water board opened the full review, everything had already stopped feeling like a simple dispute and started feeling like a system correcting itself, slow at first, almost polite, but with a weight behind it that nobody at Brighton Vale seemed prepared for. I remember that morning clearly, standing on the edge of the dry channel again, boots in the dirt, watching dust lift where water used to move like it had a memory of its own. And Marlene called me saying 3 separate agencies had now requested full documentation, not just the easement, but construction permits, drainage modifications, environmental impact notes. Everything Evan's team had signed off on without ever thinking it might get pulled apart later. And that's when I realized the fence was no longer the problem. It was just evidence sitting out in the open. Evan showed up the same afternoon, but this time he didn't bring confidence with him. He brought paperwork, folders, printouts, revisions. Like if he could overwhelm the situation with enough ink it might stop being real. He didn't even try to smile when he saw me. Just said, "They're reviewing everything now." I told him, that's usually what happens when you block a legal water right. He ran a hand through his hair, looked out toward the subdivision where the fountain still ran like nothing had changed, and for the first time, he didn't say anything back right away, like he was trying to figure out where the leverage had gone. The thing about pressure like this is it doesn't explode, it shifts, and suddenly it wasn't me pushing him anymore. It was lenders, inspectors, buyers, county engineers, all of them asking questions he should have answered before that fence ever went up. By the end of that week, construction permits for new phases of Brighton Vale were paused, and that alone started bleeding money faster than any legal argument ever could. I got a call from Evan late one night. Different tone completely, no lawyer voice, no polished phrasing, just him, tired, saying they were willing to comply fully, remove the fence, restore flow, and settle damages. I remember sitting at my kitchen table listening to him, the same table where I had first opened the easement binder, and I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. I was just past the point where emotion made decisions. I told him I wasn't interested in restoration, I was interested in correction. And then I laid it out again. Same terms as before, but now backed by county pressure, regulatory scrutiny, and the reality that his subdivision was no longer operating in isolation. Underground pipe system engineered and approved by county standards, permanent recorded easement with expanded allocation based on historical usage, and compensation structured around verified agricultural loss data, not estimates, not goodwill, actual numbers tied to output. There was a long silence on the line after that, and then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "I thought we were just moving water." That stuck with me, because that was the entire problem right there. They thought water was a design element, something you redirect, reshape, optimize. But out here it isn't infrastructure, it's survival. The final hearing didn't take long once it happened, because by then the county had already aligned with the injunction. The water board had issued their findings, and the documentation trail was airtight. Brighton Vale's legal team tried to argue intent, safety compliance, procedural misunderstanding, all the usual language people use when they realize the facts are heavier than their explanations. Marlene didn't even need to push. She just presented the chain. Easement record, obstruction, agricultural dependency, environmental consequence, financial impact on existing land use. And the judge leaned back like the decision had already been made before anyone walked in. Injunction upheld, restoration ordered, and more importantly, the settlement terms were structured under court supervision, which meant Evan didn't really get to negotiate anymore. He got to comply. I saw him one last time outside the courthouse, standing near his truck. No boots-on-the-ground arrogance left, just a guy who had built too fast without reading what was already on the land before him. He looked at me and said, "I didn't think it would go this far." And I remember thinking how often that line shows up right after someone ignores something that was never unclear to begin with. I told him, "Out here, nothing goes further than the water you interrupt." Then I walked away because there wasn't anything left to argue about. A month later, the system was rebuilt, not just restored but formalized, underground pipe installed, easement re-recorded stronger than before, flow rights expanded to reflect decades of documented use, and the fence that started it all still stood there. Same place, same line, but now it marked something very different, not ownership, but limitation. Brighton Vale kept operating, but they never really looked at that edge the same way again, because every drop of water that crossed under their land was now legally tied to mine in a way they couldn't quietly erase. And me, I went back to what I was doing before all this started, checking troughs, moving cattle, watching weather like every rancher does. But there was a shift that stayed with me. Not anger, not victory, just awareness that the quiet things out here are usually the ones that matter most until someone tries to take them away. If there's anything I learned through all of it, it's that people mistake open land for empty land, and empty land for permission. But this country doesn't really work like that. Not when everything important is already written down somewhere older than the development plans. And I'll leave it with this, because I still think about it sometimes. Was Evan wrong for trying to build, or just careless for building on something he never took time to understand? And I'd really like to know what you think. Drop a comment, tell me where you stand, because out here, opinions matter almost as much as water, almost.